In the isolated regions of northern Russia, deep in the heart of the 19th century, there existed a village that enforced one of the most disturbing laws in human history. A law so bizarre, so chilling, that it remained hidden in the shadowy corners of history, barely whispering its existence until now. The village of village name, nestled far away from the bustling cities of Russia, had a dark and peculiar decree in place. No one was allowed to give birth. The year was 1859 when this strange, terrifying rule was implemented, and it lasted for decades, suffocating the village in a shroud of fear and silence. The ban was not just a measure to control population or a bizarre superstition. It was enforced by law, keeping the villagers in a state of perpetual dread. But why? What could possibly have led a remote community, struggling with the same hardships as other villages, to create such a horrific and unnatural decree? To understand the full weight of this story, we must first step into the world of this forgotten village, set against the unforgiving backdrop of northern Russia. The land here was harsh, often covered by a blanket of snow that lasted months, with freezing winds and bone-chilling temperatures. This isolated part of the world was far from the urban centers of Russian life, where people could easily get caught up in the latest news, political debates, or scientific discoveries. Instead, life in the village was dictated by traditions that stretched back hundreds of years, deeply rooted in a mixture of superstition, religion, and the harsh realities of survival. The village had its own rules, its own customs, and its own fears. But none were as terrifying as the law that forbade childbirth. As we delve into the details of this village, it's important to remember that life in these remote areas was, in many ways, defined by isolation. The people of village name had little contact with the outside world. Trade, if it occurred, was limited to the occasional caravan making its way across the frozen tundra. News from the larger cities of St. Petersburg or Moscow took weeks, if not months, to reach them. Medical knowledge was rudimentary at best, and superstition often ruled over reason. In this environment, strange beliefs could take root, and dark, oppressive laws could go unchallenged. The villagers were left to fend for themselves, governed by fear more than law, and this fear bred something dark and unfathomable, a law that prohibited the act of bringing new life into the world. Imagine living in a place where pregnancy, the very thing that gives life to the future, was treated as a dangerous crime. To bear a child meant more than facing potential social stigma. It meant punishment, exile, or worse. No one was allowed to bring a child into the world, and this law applied to every woman, regardless of her status, age, or personal wish. The birth of a baby was seen as an act of defiance, a violation of the decree that had been imposed on them by a force far greater than their will. The question that haunts the mind, and the question that this documentary seeks to explore, is why? Why would an entire village, an entire community of people, submit to such a law? Was it rooted in genuine fear, an inexplicable tragedy, or a much deeper, darker conspiracy? As we begin to unravel this unsettling mystery, we are confronted by the fact that the villagers of village name had little choice. The law was enforced strictly, and defiance was rare, often met with dire consequences. The authorities in charge of the village were not distant figures. They were individuals who lived among the people, men and women who had witnessed the village's slow descent into silence. There were no great rebellions or uprisings, no desperate pleas for help from the villagers to the outside world. It was as though the law had woven itself into the fabric of the village's identity, so completely that no one questioned it. How could an entire population have allowed this law to continue unchecked for so long? What kind of power or influence was behind it? And why, after all these years, is this story only now emerging from the shadows of history? The first inkling we get about the origins of the law is tied to an event that occurred decades before the decree was put in place. It was said that an epidemic, mysterious and deadly, swept through the village, leaving a trail of death in its wake. The disease, whatever it may have been, seemed to strike with terrifying precision, claiming the lives of those who were most vulnerable, pregnant women and their unborn children. The deaths were often horrific, mothers and babies alike, both lost to an unknown, merciless illness that defied explanation. In a place where medical knowledge was scarce, where doctors were rare and often distant, people turned to whatever they could for answers: folklore, superstition, and fear. What was once a rare event, a tragedy that could be explained by the randomness of disease, became something more. It became a curse, a plague that was believed to be spread through childbirth itself. And so, the villagers did what they thought was necessary to protect themselves. They passed a law that forbade anyone from bearing a child. The reasoning was simple, or so they thought. If no one gave birth, the plague could not spread. If the women of the village remained barren, no more mothers or children would die. The law, however, was not a rational response. It was an act of fear, driven by superstition and panic. But in the absence of knowledge and in the face of unimaginable loss, fear has a way of convincing people that extreme measures are the only way to survive. The villagers had no way of knowing whether the epidemic was truly caused by childbirth or if they were simply grasping at straws, looking for something to blame, something they could control in a world that was spinning out of their hands. But the law didn't just end with a response to the epidemic. It became something more than just a reactionary measure. It became a part of the village's culture, its identity, and its way of life. Over the years, as the initial trauma of the epidemic faded into memory, the law remained. No one dared to question it. Women who once dreamed of having families, of raising children in the snow-dusted homes they had inherited, were forced to accept their fate. The desire for children, something that is as natural and instinctual as life itself, became a forbidden yearning. Even those who had long since resigned themselves to the law could not escape its reach, for it was more than just a legal restriction, it was a cultural one. The law became something that was enforced not just by the authorities but by the community itself. Anyone who dared to break it would face the wrath of their neighbors, the silent judgment of their fellow villagers. As the years turned into decades, the village became known not just for its eerie law but for the silence that surrounded it. There were no children's laughter in the streets, no cries of infants echoing through the cold air. The homes of the village, once brimming with life and potential, became empty, cold, and barren. The village was living in a state of quiet desperation, locked in a cycle of fear and loss, all while the outside world remained oblivious to the horrors within. It was a village that had forgotten what it meant to live fully, to embrace the cycle of life and death that all communities must face. Instead, they had chosen a path of suppression, a path that would ultimately lead them into a history that would be difficult to understand, even by those who dared to look into it. This is the eerie tale of a place where birth itself was banned, where life was locked in the cold grip of fear, and where the silence of the past still echoes through the barren streets. A place that, for a time, was consumed by a law that defied the most fundamental of human instincts, a law that still leaves us questioning the true nature of fear, superstition, and the lengths people will go to when they are faced with the unknown. The village of village name, situated in the harsh and unforgiving northern expanse of Russia, was not a place that most people would ever choose to live. Its isolation from the world around it, its extreme weather conditions, and its grueling, rugged landscape set it apart from other villages in the empire. Here, life was defined by struggle, endurance, and an eerie quietude that hung over its every corner. The winter months in particular seemed endless, stretching far beyond what most could bear. Snowstorms, blizzards, and sub-zero temperatures turned the land into a frozen wasteland for the better part of the year. The sun would disappear for weeks, leaving only the bitter cold and the perpetual silence of the tundra. In such a place, there was little room for frivolity or unnecessary luxuries. The village's survival depended on the hard work and determination of its inhabitants. The people here were hardy, resilient, and stoic, hardened by their environment and the challenges that came with it. The villagers were few in number, a tight-knit group bound by a shared understanding of what it meant to survive in one of the harshest climates on Earth. They knew that the cold could kill, that the land could break even the toughest spirit, and that life was a delicate balance between endurance and desperation. There was no room for weakness here, and no one could afford to question the rules of survival. Life in the village revolved around its self-sufficiency. The villagers hunted, farmed, and traded what they could in order to make do. They lived in small, simple houses made of timber, their interiors sparsely furnished, and their resources limited. Every family had to contribute to the collective well-being, and every action had to serve the greater good. The work was grueling, and there was little room for anything beyond the basic necessities. The long, dark winters were spent huddling around stoves, waiting for the thaw of spring, while the brief summer months offered only a fleeting respite. In the absence of modern conveniences, people here turned inward. They relied heavily on each other, and they depended on the customs and traditions that had been passed down from generation to generation. In such an isolated environment, the influence of outsiders was minimal. News from the outside world came slowly and infrequently, often months behind the events that had already shaken the larger cities of Russia. The villagers had little access to education or intellectual thought. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, if it existed at all. Doctors were few and far between, and even when they could be found, they were often ineffective against the illnesses and ailments that plagued the villagers. In an age when the scientific world was still wrestling with the basics of medicine, and when mysticism and superstition often filled the gaps in knowledge, it was easy for fear and ignorance to take root. When a mysterious illness swept through the village, it was not long before the people turned to their own beliefs, rather than seeking help from the outside world. The village's location, so far removed from any urban center, meant that its people were left to their own devices in times of crisis. And crisis, they would soon find, was on the horizon. The first signs of trouble came in the form of a series of mysterious deaths, mostly among pregnant women and their infants. The women would go to bed in the evening, healthy and with child, only to be found dead in the morning, along with their babies. Some families lost multiple generations at once, mothers, daughters, and grandchildren, all wiped out in a matter of weeks. It was a tragedy that no one could explain, and it spread quickly through the small community, sowing seeds of fear and confusion. No one knew what was causing the deaths, but they all began to wonder whether the village itself was cursed. Soon, whispers began to spread. People talked about the possibility of a sickness, an invisible enemy that took life with ruthless efficiency. But what made this sickness different was its pattern. It was as though it had been waiting for the women of the village to reach the final stages of pregnancy, then struck with a cruelty that left no chance for survival. It seemed as if the very act of bearing life had become the death sentence. The few remaining doctors and healers in the area were baffled by the number of deaths, and their attempts to find a cure were unsuccessful. They could not fathom what had caused this unprecedented phenomenon, and with no answers at hand, the people were left to grapple with their own fears. It was in this moment of fear and confusion that the village's elders stepped forward. These were the people who held the power, those who had governed the community for as long as anyone could remember. The elders were the ones who interpreted the traditions, who made the decisions that affected everyone. They were seen as wise and experienced, capable of guiding the village through even the most trying times. But when the deaths continued to mount, their wisdom was put to the test. What they decided in those early days would define the village's future for decades to come. The elders, sensing the panic that was beginning to spread through the village, did what they thought was necessary to stop the suffering. They believed that the deaths were not a result of any natural cause, but rather some supernatural force, a curse that had taken hold of their village. They looked to their past for answers, drawing on ancient beliefs and superstitions that had long been a part of their culture. Some believed that the curse was linked to a wrong committed long ago, while others thought that the village had angered the spirits of the land. The belief in a curse was so deeply entrenched in their worldview that it became the only explanation they could accept. As the number of deaths continued to rise, the elders grew more desperate. In their minds, the only way to stop the curse was to take drastic action. And so, they decreed that no one in the village was allowed to give birth. It was not a decision made lightly. The elders truly believed that this was the only way to save the community from total destruction. They argued that by preventing childbirth, they would stop the spread of the mysterious illness and avoid any further deaths. The decision was not one of cruelty, but of survival. In their minds, they were acting in the best interest of the village, sacrificing the ability to bring new life into the world in order to preserve the lives of the remaining villagers. At first, there was no resistance. The villagers, steeped in fear and uncertainty, accepted the law, believing that it was their only hope. They had no reason to question the wisdom of the elders, as they had always been the guiding force of their lives. The few who spoke out against the law were quickly silenced, either by the fear of the curse or by the social pressure to conform. The law was enforced harshly, and anyone found to be pregnant faced immediate punishment. Some were exiled from the village, forced to live in the wilderness, while others faced more severe consequences, including death. It was a law that struck at the very heart of what it meant to be human, a law that cut off the possibility of the future and left the village in a state of suspended animation, trapped in a cycle of despair and silence. As the years went by, the villagers adapted to their new reality. Birth was no longer a natural event. It was a forbidden act. The children who might have been born were never seen, their potential snuffed out before it could even begin. The village, once a place of life and hope, became a place of death and stagnation. People lived out their days, knowing that they would never see the joy of new life, that they would never hear the sound of children playing in the streets. The village became a graveyard of hopes and dreams, a place where the future was an illusion and the present was a cruel repetition of the past. But despite the passage of time, the law never wavered. The village remained silent, locked in the grip of fear and superstition. Those who came from the outside rarely visited, and when they did, they saw only the quiet, empty homes and the empty, lifeless streets. No one spoke of the law, and few questioned it. To do so would be to challenge the very foundation of the village's existence. The elders continued to rule with an iron fist, and the people continued to live under the shadow of a law that had long outlasted any rational explanation. It is against this bleak backdrop that we must understand the true weight of the law that defined this village. It wasn't just a decree, it was a condemnation. A sentence passed down from a fearful, desperate society that, unable to understand the forces around it, sought to control them through the harshest measures. It was a law that came out of fear, out of ignorance, and out of a deep desire to hold on to whatever semblance of life the village could cling to. The villagers did not know what caused the deaths. They did not understand the science behind it. All they knew was that something was happening, something beyond their comprehension, and in their fear, they chose to stop the one thing that might have allowed them to rebuild, the birth of new life. The law that forbade childbirth in the village of village name was, on the surface, a decision rooted in fear, a measure taken to prevent further death, to stop the mysterious epidemic that had ravaged the community. But behind that decree, deeper forces were at play, forces of superstition, politics, and an ancient tradition that blended the natural with the unnatural. As we try to understand the origins of the law, we must consider not just the immediate cause of the epidemic, but the broader historical and cultural context in which this decision was made. It wasn't simply the deaths of the pregnant women that led to the law. It was a combination of factors, each feeding off the other, creating a perfect storm of fear, ignorance, and power. What began as a reaction to a medical mystery slowly morphed into something far darker, with the villagers caught in a web of control and manipulation that they could not escape. The epidemic itself, whatever its cause, began innocently enough. It was a sickness like many others, a sudden outbreak that seemed to strike at random, claiming lives without rhyme or reason. But as the deaths began to multiply, a pattern emerged. It wasn't just anyone who was dying. The victims were almost exclusively women in the late stages of pregnancy. It was as though the act of carrying life itself had become the very thing that led to death. The villagers, untrained in medicine and bound by ancient traditions, saw only what they knew best, a curse. They couldn't fathom the idea that the deaths could be caused by something like bacteria or viruses, things that hadn't yet entered their understanding of the world. Instead, they turned to their beliefs, to their superstitions, to explain the unexplainable. Some believed that the village had been cursed by a wrong done long ago, an event lost in the mists of time, but which had left a lingering stain on the land. It could have been an ancestral transgression, a betrayal of the spirits of the earth or the water, or perhaps an act of defiance against the gods themselves. Such beliefs were not uncommon in remote Russian villages of the time. In these communities, where access to education and external influence was scarce, superstition often filled the gaps where reason and logic could not. The idea of a curse, a supernatural force that could control life and death, was an easier pill to swallow than the idea that there was something tangible and scientific behind the deaths. The villagers needed an explanation, and a curse, however illogical, gave them a narrative that they could grasp, even if it meant denying the reality that the epidemic was part of a natural, though tragic, pattern. But it wasn't just the belief in curses that influenced the decision to outlaw childbirth, it was also the influence of power. The village elders, the so-called leaders of the community, played a crucial role in shaping the law. These men and women were the ones who held authority in the village, who made decisions that affected everyone's lives. Their power came not just from their position but from their knowledge, or the perception of it. The elders were seen as the guardians of tradition, the ones who had the wisdom to guide the community through the darkest times. Their word was law, and in a village that had been so isolated from the rest of the world, there was little room for dissent. The elders were revered, their decisions rarely questioned, and when the epidemic struck, it was their guidance that the villagers turned to for answers. The elders, too, were steeped in superstition. Like everyone else in the village, they had grown up with stories of spirits and curses, of forces beyond human control. They believed in the power of rituals, of offerings, and of sacrifices. When the deaths continued and the panic began to spread, the elders' response was not one of inquiry or investigation, but of action, drastic action. The idea of a curse was something they could understand, and so they latched onto it as the explanation for the deaths. But more than that, they saw an opportunity to consolidate their control over the village. In a place where fear was already high, where the people were on edge, the elders could manipulate that fear to their advantage. They offered a solution, a simple one, even if it was extreme, If childbirth was the source of the curse, then the only way to stop it was to stop childbirth altogether. This was not a decision made in haste. The elders deliberated on the issue for weeks, if not months. They weighed the costs and benefits, and ultimately, they concluded that the survival of the village depended on halting reproduction. It was not an act of cruelty, in their eyes, but of necessity. They believed that the village had no future if the curse was allowed to continue unchecked. The idea of a childless future, a future without new life, was difficult to imagine, but in their minds, it was the only way to protect the living from the wrath of the curse. The decision, as drastic as it was, seemed rational in the context of the time, a time when life was fragile and when even the slightest misstep could lead to disaster. Once the law was enacted, the community had little choice but to follow. The elders' authority was absolute, and the law was enforced with strictness. Women who were pregnant were subjected to harsh penalties. Some were exiled from a village, sent out into the wilderness to fend for themselves, while others faced even worse fates. The law did not discriminate. It applied to everyone, regardless of their social standing, age, or personal wishes. It was a law that cut to the heart of the human experience, a law that denied one of the most fundamental rights, the right to bring new life into the world. But for the villagers, it was a law that they were forced to accept. Resistance was not just dangerous, it was unthinkable. To resist would mean to defy the elders, to challenge the very structure of their society. The elders were seen as the last line of defense against the curse, and defiance would be seen as an act of rebellion, not just against the law, but against the community itself. Over time, the law became ingrained in the fabric of village life. The villagers began to see childbirth as something unnatural, something to be avoided at all costs. The very mention of pregnancy became taboo. The law wasn't just enforced by the elders anymore, it was enforced by the people themselves. Neighbors watched each other closely, ready to report any signs of rebellion. Women who were suspected of being pregnant were closely monitored, and if they were found to be with child, they would face immediate punishment. It was as if the village had been transformed into a place of silence, a place where the future had been stolen from its people. The enforcement of the law, however, was not without its consequences. The psychological toll on the villagers was immense. For women, the inability to bear children was a deep, personal sorrow. The desire for a family, for the joy of raising children, was as natural as any human instinct. But in this village, that instinct had been suppressed, denied, and forbidden. The emotional pain of knowing that one's body was capable of creating life, but that life could never come into being, was a wound that festered deep within the hearts of the villagers. Women who had dreamed of becoming mothers were forced to bury those dreams, to silence the yearning within them. And for the men, the grief was no less profound. The absence of children meant the absence of legacy, the absence of hope for the future. The village became a place where the cycle of life had been broken, where the generations that should have followed were never allowed to be born. Yet, even in the face of such an extreme law, the village managed to survive. The people continued to live, to work, to endure, despite the loss of new life. They did so because they had no other choice. The law became a part of the village's identity, so deeply ingrained that it was as much a part of the community as the land itself. But this silence came at a cost. It cost them their children. It cost them their future. And it cost them their humanity. For what is a village, a community, a people, without the laughter of children, without the promise of tomorrow? As time passed, the law that had once seemed like the only solution became a suffocating burden. The villagers, having lived under its weight for so long, began to wonder if it had been the right decision. Was it truly a curse that had struck them down, or had it simply been a series of tragic, random events? Could they have prevented the deaths without resorting to such a drastic measure? The question lingered, but it was a question that could never be answered fully. The past had been written, and the law remained. It had become part of the village's history, part of its identity, a dark chapter that would never be erased. And so, the village lived on, locked in a timeless cycle of silence, its people bound by a law that had no true explanation, only the weight of fear and superstition. The law, once seen as the village's salvation, became its prison, and the village of village name remained forever haunted by the ghosts of the children that never were. The eerie law that forbade childbirth in the village of village name was not only a cultural and social anomaly, but also a deeply tragic event tied to a medical crisis that remained as enigmatic as the village's silence. The origins of this law, though rooted in fear and superstition, also carried with them a medical mystery that the people of this isolated community struggled to understand. The deaths of pregnant women, and the subsequent enactment of the ban, were symptomatic of something much more insidious than a mere supernatural curse. They hinted at an underlying medical crisis that the villagers were powerless to comprehend, much less prevent. The village, cut off from modern medical knowledge and unable to fathom the complexities of disease, had to grapple with a terror they could neither explain nor combat. What was happening to these women, and why did it seem that only those who were pregnant fell victim to it? What invisible force was claiming lives in such a targeted way? In a time when medical science was in its infancy and the connection between disease and its transmission was not fully understood, the villagers had few answers, and fewer still were available to provide them. Doctors were rare in rural areas, particularly in remote locations like this one, and even when they could be found, their knowledge was limited. In the absence of a formal medical establishment, the villagers relied on folk remedies, superstitions, and the collective wisdom of the elders to guide them through times of illness. Yet, this knowledge was not equipped to deal with the mystery that was unfolding in their midst. There was no framework in which the villagers could understand what was happening, and as a result, the community's response was driven by fear and ignorance rather than informed reasoning. The first cases of death came without warning. Women, who had been perfectly healthy throughout their pregnancies, suddenly fell ill and died, often overnight. The causes of death were unclear. There were no obvious symptoms that could point to a specific disease or condition. It wasn't like the typical illnesses that had ravaged the village in the past, illnesses that could be identified by their fever, rashes, or general signs of infection. This was different. These women appeared to be in perfect health before they suddenly succumbed to something unknown. Their deaths were accompanied by the death of their unborn children, compounding the tragedy and leaving the village in a state of profound grief and confusion. As the deaths mounted, the villagers began to notice a troubling pattern. It was almost always pregnant women who were affected. This realization deepened the mystery. Why were these women dying when others in the community seemed unaffected? It seemed as though childbirth itself had become a dangerous undertaking. The very act of carrying a child, something so natural and fundamental to human existence, had suddenly turned fatal. No one knew why this was happening, but the pattern was undeniable. It was as if a dark force had marked these women, claiming them and their children before they had a chance to live. The village, isolated and lacking any formal medical institutions, was unable to seek answers from the outside world. At the time, Russian villages like this one were disconnected from the scientific advancements that were slowly making their way into the cities. The villagers had little to no understanding of germ theory, of the ways in which diseases could be transmitted, or how infections could spread within a community. This lack of knowledge left them with nothing but their suspicions and fears to explain the deaths. Some believed the deaths were linked to a particular disease that had been spreading through the village. There were whispers of a fever, a mysterious illness that seemed to take hold of the women only when they reached the later stages of pregnancy. The symptoms, however, were not well documented, and no one could agree on what exactly the disease was. Some suspected that the women had been infected by something in the environment, perhaps the water, the food, or the air. Others thought that the sickness could be spread through physical contact or by the act of childbirth itself. There was a belief, common in the region at the time, that the process of giving birth was fraught with dangers, and that the body, weakened by the effort, was more susceptible to illness afterward. Some even believed that the fever was a result of a spiritual imbalance, a curse that had fallen upon the village and was carried through the women who bore children. In their desperation, the villagers turned to the only thing they knew, their elders. The village leaders, who were seen as the final authority on all matters of life and death, took it upon themselves to find a solution. Yet, despite their power and wisdom, they too were at a loss. They had no medical knowledge to guide them, only the old beliefs and traditions that had been passed down through generations. They consulted the ancient texts, the old remedies, and the stories of the past, but nothing seemed to provide an answer to the mystery that was unfolding before them. And so, with no viable solution in sight, the elders did what they felt was necessary. They imposed the law that no one in the village could give birth. This decision, extreme as it was, seemed logical to them at the time. If childbirth was the cause of the deaths, then it only made sense to stop it altogether. To prevent further deaths, to protect the village from the unknown threat that seemed to lurk behind every pregnancy, they reasoned that the only way forward was to outlaw the act of giving birth. The law, while drastic, was intended to be a protective measure, a way to preserve the village from further loss. The elders were not malicious. They were simply responding to the crisis as best as they could, using the knowledge and resources available to them at the time. But the decision did not come without its costs. The law, once imposed, was brutally enforced. Pregnant women were not allowed to carry their pregnancies to term. Anyone found to be pregnant was subject to exile or, in some cases, worse. This was not a matter of choice. It was an edict, a command that could not be disobeyed without severe consequences. The villagers were left with no recourse but to accept the law, even if it meant the death of their hopes for the future. Women who had once dreamed of becoming mothers, who had planned for the arrival of their children, were now forced to bury those dreams, perhaps never to be realized. As the years went on, the situation in the village only grew more dire. The law, though intended as a temporary measure, became entrenched in the fabric of the community. It was no longer seen as an emergency response to a medical crisis. It became a way of life. The people of the village adjusted to a world without children. The homes that should have been filled with the sounds of babies' cries and the laughter of young children were eerily silent. The village itself, once a thriving community, now seemed like a ghost town, empty, barren, and still. The women of the village, once hopeful, now lived in a state of perpetual mourning not just the children they could not have, but the very loss of life itself. The medical mystery that had sparked the law was never solved. The fever that had claimed the lives of so many pregnant women seemed to vanish as mysteriously as it had arrived, but the law remained. The villagers, left to deal with the aftermath of the tragedy, found themselves in a perpetual state of grief and confusion. They had no answers, no closure, only the heavy weight of the law that had been forced upon them. The outside world never came to their aid, never intervened to investigate the cause of the epidemic. The village remained isolated, a place where life itself had been outlawed, a place where the very essence of humanity, the ability to create new life, was extinguished. As we look back on this chilling episode in history, it becomes clear that the village name was a victim of a medical crisis it could not understand, compounded by a cultural and societal framework that did not allow for open inquiry or external help. The villagers were trapped in a web of fear, ignorance, and superstition, and the only solution they could imagine was the most extreme one possible: to stop birth altogether. It was a decision that would haunt them for generations, a decision that would strip them of their future, and leave them locked in a dark chapter of history that would remain hidden from the world for years to come. The legacy of the law that forbade childbirth in the village name is not simply one of cultural repression and tragic loss. It is also a stark reminder of the profound psychological and emotional toll that such an oppressive decree exacted on the people who lived under it. The decision to outlaw birth, to cut off the very possibility of new life, created a deep wound in the heart of the village, a wound that festered over decades. It wasn't just the loss of children that devastated the villagers, it was the slow, creeping erosion of hope itself. Hope, something so intrinsic to the human spirit, was slowly strangled under the weight of the law. The villagers, once a proud and resilient community, found themselves living in a state of perpetual grief, trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. To fully understand the emotional and psychological toll of this law, we must first consider what it means to be human. At the core of every human being is the drive to create, to build, to nurture the next generation. For the women of the village, this drive was perhaps the most powerful of all. Motherhood is not merely a biological function. It is a deeply ingrained part of the human experience, an expression of care, love, and connection. To have a child is to pass on a legacy, to create life, and to nurture that life into the future. It is a process that connects us to our ancestors, to our culture, and to the broader human story. In the village name, this most natural of desires was systematically denied. For the women who lived under this law, the inability to bear children was a crushing blow. It was not just a personal tragedy, it was a societal one. A woman who could not have children was seen as incomplete, as if she had been robbed of her purpose in life. The law left many women feeling trapped in a silent mourning, where their grief could not be expressed, not because they were unwilling, but because the law itself suppressed it. How could one mourn the loss of something that was never allowed to exist? The village had no room for open expressions of grief or loss. There were no funerals for the children who would never be born, no ceremonies to mark the absence of future generations. Instead, the sorrow was buried deep within, silently festering as the years passed. The psychological impact of this law was also felt by the men of the village. While the focus was often on the women who had been denied their maternal instincts, the fathers were equally affected. The absence of children in their homes left a vacuum, a void that could never be filled. For many, the idea of fatherhood was something they had looked forward to with pride, a role that gave their lives meaning. The absence of children meant that their legacy would die with them. Fathers who once envisioned teaching their sons to hunt, their daughters to weave, were now left with nothing but an empty house and a growing sense of despair. This loss of purpose was not something that could easily be overcome. For these men, their role as providers and protectors had been rendered meaningless by a law they had no power to change. For the elders, the ones who had imposed this law in the first place, the psychological toll was no less severe. They, too, had to live with the consequences of their decision. Though they had acted out of a belief that they were protecting the village, the reality of what they had done must have haunted them. The law they had put in place was not just a matter of governance, it was a matter of life and death. The absence of children, of new life, would have weighed heavily on the minds of the elders, particularly as they watched the village slowly wither. What had once been a thriving, hopeful community was now a place defined by grief and silence. As the years passed, the elders must have realized that the solution they had devised was not one of salvation, but one of destruction. They had traded one form of death for another, the death of hope, the death of the future. And yet, there was nothing they could do to undo what had been done. The law also had an impact on the very fabric of the community. In any society, children represent the future. They are the ones who carry forward the traditions, the culture, and the values of the past. They are the lifeblood of any civilization. In the village name, this lifeblood had been severed, and the result was a stagnation that affected every aspect of life. The absence of children meant that there were no new voices to challenge the old ways, no new ideas to spark change. The village became stuck in a loop, a cycle of repeating the same patterns without ever moving forward. The older generation held all the power, and the younger generation, the one that should have inherited that power, was never allowed to exist. The villagers were left to watch as their world slowly crumbled around them, unable to break free from the chains of the past. The law also created a profound sense of isolation. The village, already isolated by its remote location, now became an island unto itself in an even more profound way. It was a place where the natural course of life had been interrupted, where the cycle of birth and death was distorted. The villagers were cut off not just from the outside world, but from the most fundamental aspect of human existence, the ability to create new life. In the absence of children, the village was left without a sense of renewal, without a sense of hope for the future. This isolation deepened over time, as the villagers came to realize that they were alone in their suffering, unable to share their grief with the outside world. The psychological burden was not just individual, it was collective. The villagers' trauma was passed down from generation to generation. The younger people, growing up in a world where the sound of a baby's cry was unheard, grew up in a society that was marked by a deep, unspoken sorrow. They were raised without the knowledge of what it meant to have children, without the possibility of ever experiencing the joy of parenthood. They were raised in a world where the future was a distant memory, where the past was all that remained. And yet, the psychological toll of the law was not just felt by those who lived through it, it also affected those who came after. In many ways, the legacy of the law was one of psychological trauma that rippled through generations. The villagers were not just deprived of the joy of having children, they were deprived of their very sense of purpose. Their community, once a vibrant and thriving group of people, had become a place of silence and stagnation. The sense of hopelessness that pervaded the village was not simply a reflection of the past, it was something that shaped the present, something that cast a long shadow over every aspect of life. The villagers lived in a state of suspended animation, trapped in a world where the future was never allowed to arrive, and where the past could never truly be put to rest. The psychological toll of the law was also compounded by the villagers' inability to escape. There was no refuge from the law, no way to leave the village and start anew. The isolation of the village was both physical and emotional. It was a place where people had no way of coping with their grief, no way of processing their trauma. The village itself had become a prison, and the law that had been enacted to save it had instead sentenced its people to a lifetime of sorrow and despair. As time passed, the once vibrant community became a shadow of itself. The people of village name lived on, but they did so without the essential spark of life that comes from the birth of new generations. They were a people caught in the grips of fear, superstition, and the harsh realities of a world that had left them behind. The law that had been put in place to protect them had instead trapped them in a never-ending cycle of grief and loss. The villagers were left to wonder what might have been if they had been allowed to live according to nature's laws, if they had been allowed to bring new life into the world. But those questions could never be answered. The law was absolute, and its consequences were irreversible. The legacy of the village name is not just one of loss, it is one of the profound and lasting impact that fear, ignorance, and the denial of life can have on the human soul. The years passed, and the once thriving village name began to sink deeper into a quiet desolation. The chilling decree that forbade childbirth, meant to protect the community from the mysterious epidemic, had instead left the village crippled. Its soul was ravaged, not by the loss of individuals, but by the loss of a future that could no longer be born. The impact of the law was no longer confined to the personal pain of women who could not bear children or the grief of men who would never see their legacy carried on by the hands of their offspring. It began to touch every aspect of life in the village, from the daily routine to the very identity of the community. As the years wore on, the law became more than just a restriction. It became a defining feature of life in the village, one that shaped how the villagers interacted with each other, with their environment, and with their own sense of self. At first, the villagers, though grieving, still held on to the hope that the epidemic that had caused the deaths of pregnant women would somehow subside and that the law could be reversed. After all, the law had been enacted as a temporary measure, a desperate response to an incomprehensible crisis. But as time wore on, and the mystery of the deaths faded into history, the law remained. It became not just a solution to an immediate crisis but a part of the village's identity. What began as an emergency measure to protect the people from a seemingly uncontrollable death toll became institutionalized, embedded deeply into the fabric of village life. The elders, who had once wielded authority as the community's guides through crises, found themselves trapped by the very law they had set in motion. It was no longer just a matter of stopping the deaths. It had become a matter of maintaining control, of keeping the peace in a village where peace was bought at the cost of the future. The decision to outlaw childbirth, once seen as a necessary evil, became increasingly difficult to question. The very idea of giving birth had become taboo. The idea of new life, once celebrated as the greatest miracle, now felt like a danger, a potential death sentence for both mother and child. The villagers, already bound by the superstitions that had informed their response to the epidemic, now viewed pregnancy itself as something to be feared. The once sacred act of creation, of giving life, was now equated with death, and the law that prohibited it was no longer questioned, not even by the younger generation, who had grown up under its shadow. The lack of new life in the village was palpable. The once bustling homes now stood empty, devoid of the sounds of children's laughter, the energy that had once brought the village to life. The fields that should have been filled with children running and playing, learning the ways of the land, now sat untouched. The elderly, the only ones who remembered a time when the village had been full of youth and promise, were now the keepers of a fading memory, a memory of a time when life had felt abundant. The village, once vibrant and full of possibility, had become a place frozen in time, where the cycle of life had been interrupted and the future had been stolen. In the absence of children, the villagers turned inward. They focused on maintaining their community, on keeping the traditions alive, even as the village slowly withered away. Without the arrival of new generations, the old ways began to feel more like relics of the past than living traditions. The village had become a place where the present was dominated by the past. The people lived in an endless loop of repetition, with no hope for a tomorrow, no hope for growth, no hope for renewal. This stagnation affected not only the daily life of the villagers but also their mental and emotional states. With no new life to look forward to, the villagers began to wither emotionally, trapped in a cycle of grief and loss that seemed impossible to escape. What was most tragic, perhaps, was the sense of isolation that the law imposed upon the villagers. They were already geographically isolated, cut off from the rest of the world by the vast, icy expanse of the Russian north. But the law that forbade childbirth made them emotionally isolated as well. They could not turn to the outside world for help, for understanding, or for support. No one outside the village could comprehend the depth of their sorrow, and no one could help them solve the mystery of the deaths that had precipitated the law in the first place. The villagers had become trapped in their own self-imposed isolation, unable to break free from the chains of their past. They could no longer rely on the natural order of life to guide them. They were caught in an unnatural state, one where the future had been locked away, and the past could never be fully healed. This isolation, both physical and emotional, began to take its toll on the villagers' mental health. With no new generations to bring joy or energy into their lives, the villagers began to feel as though they were living in a dead world. Their days became repetitive, a blur of monotonous routines that offered no hope for change. The absence of children left an emptiness in their hearts, one that could never be filled. The sense of grief and longing was constant, like a heavy weight that pressed down on their spirits. Those who had once been full of life, full of energy and hope, now moved through their days with a sense of resignation. It was as though they had been condemned to live in a world without purpose, where their lives had no meaning beyond the simple act of survival. For the women of the village, the psychological impact was even more pronounced. They had once dreamed of becoming mothers, of holding their children in their arms, of teaching them the ways of their people. But those dreams had been shattered by the law. They were forced to live in a world where their most fundamental desire had been denied, and where their very bodies had become a source of fear and shame. The inability to bear children was not just a personal loss, it was a social one. Women were expected to fulfill certain roles in the community, and motherhood was at the heart of those roles. Without children, women found themselves in an emotionally barren world, where they were left to question their worth, their purpose, and their identity. The law had stripped them of the ability to fulfill their most sacred role, and it had left them with nothing but sorrow and a deep sense of disconnection from their community and their own bodies. As the years turned into decades, the villagers began to forget the world outside their borders. They had no connection to the larger world of Russia, to the cities where life and progress were moving forward. The village had become a relic, a place trapped in time, where the passage of the years brought no change. It was a place where the future had been halted, and the only thing that remained was the slow, inevitable decay of the present. The outside world had long since forgotten about them, and the villagers had long since stopped hoping for anything more. They had accepted their fate, however painful it was. The law had become part of their identity, as inescapable as the cold that gripped the land around them. It was not just a law, it was a way of life. The elders, who had once been the architects of this law, began to sense that the community they had fought to protect was no longer the same. The emotional and psychological toll was visible in the faces of the younger villagers, who had grown up under the shadow of the law. They had never known the joy of childhood, never known the joy of parenthood, and so they had never known what it was to truly live. The cycle of grief and loss that had defined the village for so long had become their reality, and they had come to accept it as normal. There was no questioning of the law anymore. It had become part of the very fabric of the village, an unspoken truth that no one dared to challenge. In time, the village name became a ghost town, a place where the past lingered in the silence of abandoned homes and empty streets. The legacy of the law that had sought to protect the village had instead destroyed it. It had robbed the villagers of their future, their hope, and their very sense of self. The village had become a place frozen in time, its people trapped in a cycle of grief and loss that could never be undone. And so, the village remained, a dark testament to the destructive power of fear, superstition, and the denial of life itself. The truth of the matter was that the law that had once seemed like a temporary solution to an inexplicable crisis had, over time, grown into a permanent part of the village's identity, its psyche, and its very way of life. What had started as an attempt to protect the community from an unknown and terrifying epidemic had slowly spiraled into something far more insidious, a self-sustaining cycle of isolation, despair, and conformity. The absence of children, the denial of life itself, had not only left the village in a state of grief, but it had also stripped its people of their ability to change, to evolve, and to hope. It had left them trapped in a static world where the passage of time seemed irrelevant, and where the future had been replaced by an ever-present past. The villagers, though outwardly surviving, were inwardly stunted, living in the shadow of a law that not only denied them the joy of new life but also deprived them of their basic human agency, the agency to make their own choices, to shape their own future. As the years stretched into decades, the psychological weight of this self-imposed silence became even more suffocating. Those who had grown up in the village were born into this strange, warped existence where the act of giving birth had become unthinkable, even sinful. They had never known a world in which children could be born without fear, in which the simple joy of pregnancy was celebrated rather than shunned. The very notion of family had been so thoroughly entwined with sorrow and repression that it became almost impossible to imagine a different reality. For the younger generations, the law was no longer just a fact of life. It was an unquestionable truth. To be born in this village was to be born into a world where the possibility of children, of new life, was entirely out of reach. This reality, deeply ingrained over generations, fostered a sense of hopelessness and futility. It was as though the villagers had been conditioned to accept their lot as something inevitable, something beyond their control. There was no challenge, no rebellion, because they had internalized the law so fully that even to question it felt like an act of defiance against nature itself. This psychological stasis was compounded by the complete lack of outside influence. The village had become a world unto itself, isolated not only geographically but also culturally and emotionally. In a time when the world was changing rapidly, with advancements in medicine, technology, and social norms sweeping across much of Russia and Europe, the villagers remained ensnared in a timeless void. They had no connection to the outside world, no understanding of the broader scientific or cultural shifts that were unfolding just beyond their borders. The isolation was not just physical, it was intellectual and emotional. The villagers, who had once been part of a larger cultural tapestry, were now living in a sort of historical stasis, where the events of the outside world were at best distant rumors, and at worst, irrelevant to their daily lives. The law, the isolation, and the grief had created a community that was in some ways frozen in time, suspended between the past and the present, with no way to move forward. This stasis was not just social, it was also economic. Without children, there was no natural replenishment of the labor force. The village, which had once been a productive and thriving community, began to lose its vibrancy. The elderly population grew larger as the younger generation remained static, and with fewer hands to work the land, the village's productivity began to decline. Without children to inherit the land, to learn the old crafts, to tend to the fields, the village started to lose its former sense of purpose. The once vibrant marketplace, filled with the sounds of bargaining and the bustle of daily life, grew quieter, as fewer people had the energy or the will to keep it going. The very economic foundation of the village began to crumble, not because the land was no longer fertile, but because the will to work it, to sustain it, had disappeared. The labor force, once vibrant with youth and energy, had become stagnant, and the village's economy followed suit. The once productive fields lay fallow, the homes stood empty, and the marketplace, which had once served as a symbol of the village's self-sufficiency, had grown eerily silent. The emotional and psychological toll on the villagers did not just manifest in their daily lives, it also began to affect their health. In a community where the future had been blocked, where hope had been extinguished, the physical manifestations of this despair became apparent. The villagers aged faster, their spirits broken by the oppressive weight of the law and its consequences. They had been living in a state of perpetual mourning, unable to release their grief or find a way to move forward. This chronic grief and stagnation took a toll on their bodies, too. The physical signs of aging became more pronounced. The once strong bodies of the villagers, who had once toiled in the fields with vigor, were now frail and weakened. Their skin, once tanned and tough from working under the sun, had grown pale and drawn. The once bright eyes of the younger villagers had become dull, clouded with years of sorrow and fatigue. It was as though the village itself was decaying from the inside out, its people physically aging faster than they should, as though time was moving in reverse, toward death, not toward life. The law also brought with it a deepening sense of collective guilt. The villagers knew that their fate was tied to the decision that had been made so long ago, but the guilt was not just rooted in the law itself. It was also rooted in the knowledge that the village had failed to adapt. They had been given an opportunity to choose a different path, to confront the epidemic with new ideas, new solutions, and new ways of thinking, but they had chosen instead to close themselves off from the world. They had rejected the possibility of progress, of change, in favor of a law that had ultimately condemned them to a slow, agonizing death. And the guilt was not just collective, it was personal. Each villager carried within them the weight of this decision. Even those who were born after the law was enacted could not escape the sense of responsibility for the choices made by their ancestors. They were born into this world of grief and repression, and the weight of it had become part of their lives, part of their identity. They could never escape it, no matter how hard they tried. And so, they lived with the knowledge that their ancestors, in an attempt to protect them, had destroyed them instead. They lived in a world where the law had become both a shield and a prison, a shield from an unknown threat, but a prison that kept them trapped in a past that was no longer relevant.